In 546 BC, two armies marched onto a disputed plain in southern Greece, sized each other up, and then did something strange. They turned around and went home, and behind them they left 600 hand-picked men, 300 from each side, with instructions to settle the conflict among themselves. When the sun went down, 3 of those 600 were still on their feet, and nothing had been settled at all. How the Greek world arrived at that afternoon, and why it kept running the same experiment for centuries afterward, is a story that starts a very long way from Greece. The idea sounds almost reasonable when you say it out loud. Two armies are about to tear into each other over a border or an insult. Thousands of farmers and herdsmen will be cut down over a quarrel most of them didn't start. So instead, each side sends out its best man. The two of them fight. The gods reveal their verdict through the outcome, and everybody else gets to go home. The Greeks came to call this kind of arrangement monomachia, or in English, the single fight, or single combat. For a concept built on such clean logic, it had a spectacular tendency to fall apart in practice. The oldest detailed account of a duel like this doesn't come from Greece at all. It comes from ancient Egypt. The tale of Sinuhe, composed around 1900 BC, follows an Egyptian courtier who flees his homeland after a palace crisis and rises to wealth among the tribes of the Levant. His success attracts a challenger, a local strongman who wants his herds and announces he'll take them in single combat. The whole tribe turns out to watch. The champion charges, and Sinuhe puts an arrow through his neck, and then finishes him with the man's own axe. After he takes out this local strongman, he claims everything the man owned, as well as the loyalty of all his retainers. The story was already ancient when the Greeks were learning to write, and its narrative beats would repeat for the next 2,000 years. The Bible preserves what is undoubtedly the most famous version of single combat in history. In the first book of Samuel, the Philistine champion Goliath stands in the valley of Elah for 40 days, offering explicit terms. Send one man against him, and the losing side will serve the winners. A shepherd named David drops him with a sling stone and finishes the job with the giant's own sword. But notice what happens next, since the Philistines don't honor the bargain and submit, instead breaking and running. The terms of the duel evaporated the moment the duel ended, and that pattern would follow champion combat everywhere it went, Greece included. Greek warriors didn't need to import the concept, though. They had it in the one book every literate Greek absorbed from childhood, the Iliad, which took the shape we know sometime around the 8th century BC. Homeric warfare revolves around champions, the frontline fighters who step out ahead of the mass of men to seek each other by name. In the third book of the poem, the entire Trojan War nearly ends in an afternoon. Paris, the man who started everything by running off with Helen, agrees to fight her husband Menelaus in a formal duel. The terms are sworn with sacrifices and oaths. Helen and her treasure go to the winner, and both armies part in an uneasy friendship. Menelaus wins the fight in every conceivable way that counts, that is, except one. His spear tears through Paris's shield, his sword shatters on the Trojan's helmet, and he ends up dragging Paris across the field by the helmet strap, strangling him with his own chin piece. Then the strap snaps, and the poem says, Aphrodite plucked her favorite off the battlefield and deposited him safely in his own bedroom. However you read that rescue, the duel produces no body. Both sides start arguing about the result, and an arrow from the Trojan lines soon ends the truce for good. Homer had already identified the fatal flaw in champion combat. It only works if everyone agrees to accept the verdict, and the losing side almost never does. The problem is, despite one side's champion falling, the actual fighting strength of the opposing armies remains largely unchanged. There are morale hits and boosts, sure, but at the end of the day, the losing side rarely accepts the result. The seventh book stages a second duel, and this one fails more gently than the first. Hector and Ajax hammer each other until the heralds call the fight on account of darkness, and the two men part with an exchange of gifts, a sword from Hector and a belt from Ajax. Sophocles, writing 3 centuries later, lingered on what became of those gifts. Ajax perished on that sword, and in Sophocles' telling, though not in Homer directly, Hector was lashed to Achilles' chariot with that belt and dragged until the life was torn from him. Gifts from enemies, the Greeks concluded after centuries of taking in the Iliad, are no gifts at all. And then there's the 22nd book, where single combat sheds every rule it ever had. Hector, facing Achilles alone before the walls of Troy, proposes a pact that the winner will return the loser's body for burial. Achilles refuses outright, telling him that lions and men don't swear oaths to each other. What follows is less a trial before the gods than a one-sided thrashing, since according to Homer, Achilles was the greatest warrior in history, decked out in literal divine equipment. Modern historians still argue over whether any of these duels reflect how Bronze Age warriors actually fought, or whether they're poetic theater. Either way, the aristocrats of classical Greece took them as a manual as to how to behave on the battlefield. And these ancient Greeks accepted the Iliad as something close to sacred scripture, and the heroes as something to be closely mimicked. The first Greek duel that comes down to us with names, a place, and an approximate date happened around 607 BC, and it reads like something out of the arena. Athens and Mytilene were fighting over Sigeum, a promontory on the coast near the ruins of Troy itself, a piece of symbolism that was lost on nobody involved. The Athenian commander was Phrynon, an Olympic victor, a champion in the Pancration according to Diogenes Laertius. The Mytilenean commander was a man named Pittacus, and when the two generals agreed to settle the campaign in single combat, Pittacus came prepared. He'd reportedly concealed a fishing net beneath his shield, and when the moment came, he flung it over the Olympic champion, tangled him, and cut him down. Centuries later, the Romans would build an entire gladiator type around that exact matchup, the netman against the armored fighter. Pittacus went home a hero, ruled Mytilene as an elected strongman, and ended up ranked among the 7 sages of Greece. The conflict, on the other hand, didn't end with the duel, and Herodotus tells us the fighting over Sigeum ground on until Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, was called in to arbitrate. One champion had slain another in front of 2 armies, and the dispute simply outlived them both. By Pittacus's lifetime, the lone champion was already becoming a relic because Greek battlefield tactics were reorganizing itself around the hoplite phalanx. The new style was built on farmer citizens standing shoulder to shoulder, each man's round shield covering his own left side and his neighbor's right. A formation like that is exactly as strong as its unbroken line, and a man who stepped out of rank to chase personal glory opened a gap that could get his whole file trampled. Tyrtaeus, the Spartan poet of the mid-600s BC, spelled out the new ethic in verse. Glory now belonged to the man who planted his feet and stayed beside his comrades. Heroic individualism, the kind that elevated Achilles, had turned into a tactical liability. But the old instinct refused to vanish entirely, and if one champion per side couldn't produce a verdict anyone would honor, maybe 300 could. This brings us back to that plain in 546 where I started this segment. Herodotus, writing about a century afterward, lays out what happened. Sparta and Argos, the 2 oldest rivals in the Peloponnese, both claimed the border district of Thyrea, and Sparta had occupied it. The Argive army marched out, and somewhere short of a full battle, the two sides struck a deal. 300 picked men from each city would fight for the territory, and both main armies would withdraw completely. If they stayed and watched, Herodotus explains, one side or the other would be tempted to pile in when its men started losing. They fought all day, and Herodotus wastes no words describing the fighting. By nightfall, 3 men were left alive out of 600, and 2 of them were Argives, Alcinor, and Chromius. They concluded reasonably enough that they'd won. They ran home to Argos with the news. The third was a Spartan named Othraiades, and instead of leaving, he stayed on the field, stripped the armor from the fallen Argives, and carried it back to the Spartan lines. There he held his post among the field of combat through the night. The next morning, both cities claimed victory, and both had a case. Argos had more survivors, but Sparta had the man who'd held the field, which by Greek convention was the marker of victory. There was no umpire, and there was no real appetite for compromise. So the 2 full armies came back and fought the pitched battle the entire arrangement had been designed to prevent. The losses were heavy on both sides, and when it was over, Sparta held the contested territory for the next 2 centuries. Herodotus records the strange cultural scar the day left behind. The Argives, who'd worn their hair long, cut it short and swore a binding oath that no Argive man would grow his hair, and no Argive woman would wear gold until Thyrea was recovered. The Spartans, who'd worn their hair short, adopted the opposite custom and grew it long from then on, a look that became their trademark for centuries. As for Othraiades, Herodotus says the man couldn't bear the prospect of returning to Sparta as the only one of his 300 left standing. Tradition held that rather than leave his brothers behind, he painted a dedication to Zeus with his own blood on as many shields as he could before he collapsed. The embellishments tell you how much the story came to matter, but in the end, it also says how little even this modified version of single combat really mattered. This was the grandest and most carefully engineered champion combat the Greek world ever staged, and it settled precisely nothing. 2 centuries later, the duel came back one more time, in front of the most famous audience in the ancient world. In 325, Alexander the Great's army was recovering from its brutal Indian campaign, and at a banquet thick with wine, the old resentment between Macedonians and Greeks boiled over. The 2 sides were about to break out into full-fledged combat in the camp when something Homeric came across the men. A Macedonian soldier named Choragus, a man who'd distinguished himself in battle many times, challenged Dioxippus of Athens to single combat. Dioxippus was an Olympic champion in the Pancration, the ancient world's near-anything-goes fighting event. Alexander set a date for the contest, and an enormous crowd turned out to watch. Choragus arrived in full armor, carrying a javelin, a long Macedonian lance, and a sword. Dioxippus walked out fully oiled up, wearing absolutely nothing and carrying nothing but a wooden club like the divine Heracles had come to visit. Choragus threw the javelin, and Dioxippus swayed out of its path. Choragus leveled the lance and charged, and Dioxippus shattered the shaft with one blow of the club. As the Macedonian reached for his sword, the athlete closed the distance, seized his sword arm, swept him off his feet, and planted a foot on his neck. The whole thing was over in moments, and there was nothing to dispute which, as it turned out, was now part of the problem. While the fight solved the dispute between the 2 rival factions in Alexander's camp, Dioxippus had, unfortunately, made Choragus, the Macedonian, look like a complete fool. Alexander was visibly displeased at watching a Greek humiliate a Macedonian in front of the assembled camp. Within days, a golden cup vanished at a feast and was found planted under Dioxippus's pillow, and he was denounced as a thief in front of the court. He understood exactly what was happening, and he protested to Alexander, calling it a travesty, before maintaining his honor and bringing shame to his enemies in the traditional manner. Interestingly, this is the only duel in this entire segment, with an undisputed winner, that actually resolved the wider conflict, and winning destroyed him within a week. And even then, the concept of single combat wasn't entirely finished in the ancient Greek world. After Alexander's death, his generals turned on each other, and around 321 BC, near the Hellespont, two of them met in the middle of a cavalry battle. Neoptolemus was an aristocrat and a veteran commander. Eumenes of Cardia was a Greek who'd spent his career as the royal secretary, a paperwork man the Macedonian officers openly sneered at. Plutarch describes them spotting one another mid-battle and driving their horses together like ramming warships. They dropped their reins, grabbed each other, tore at helmets and armor straps, and when the horses bolted out from under them, they kept wrestling on the ground. Eumenes took wounds of his own, but it was his blow to the neck that finished it. More than 8 centuries after the traditional date for the fall of Troy, on the edge of the Hellespont, Homer's duel of champions was still being fought by Greeks. But in the end, the age of champions was over in the ancient Hellenic world, and overall, the concept of single combat as a deciding factor seems to have been a resounding failure. It was good for raising the profile of individual fighters, but it virtually never solved any actual conflict, even in highly romanticized tellings. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support to the next level. The Odyssey doesn't just name Ithaca, it describes it, in the hero's own voice, with the specificity of a man giving you his home address. And when you actually follow those directions, they don't lead to the island called Ithaca, they lead somewhere else. Which means one of two things happened. Either the greatest poet in Western history got his own hero's homeland wrong, or we've been reading Homer's notes incorrectly. The description comes in Book 9 of the Odyssey, at the court of the Phaeacian king Alcinous. Odysseus finally reveals who he is, and in doing so he tells them exactly where he's from. He lives, he says, in sunny Ithaca, where a mountain called Neriton stands covered in rustling woods. Around it lie many islands close to one another, Dulichion, Sami, and forested Zacynthos. Ithaca itself, he says, lies low and farthest out to sea toward the dusk, while the others sit apart, facing the dawn and the sun. 2 of those names are easy. Zacynthos is still on the map today as Zakynthos, and Sami matches Kephallonia, the group's largest island, where a port town called Sami still sits on the eastern coast. Dulichion, whose name suggests a long island, has simply vanished, and scholars have been hunting for it for millennia. But the real problem is Ithaca itself. The island that's carried the name for well over 2,000 years, Ithaki, is mountainous, climbing to roughly 800 meters. It's nobody's idea of low-lying, and it sits tucked against Kephallonia's eastern side, toward the sunrise, and it isn't farthest out to sea in any direction that makes sense. Odysseus describes a flat outlier facing the sunset, and yet Ithaki is a vertical island facing the dawn. The poems offer more clues than that one passage, and in Book 4, Telemachus politely declines a gift of horses from Menelaus. This is because Ithaca has no wide plains or meadows to drive them on. It's rugged country, more suited for goats than for horses. When Odysseus finally comes home in Book 13, Homer names the Bay of Phorcys, where the ship lands, and the Cave of the Nymphs above the bay. He also names a landmark called Raven's Rock, near the farm of the loyal swineherd Eumaeus. Further, while Odysseus is away, Penelope's suitors planned to ambush Telemachus on his way home, and they stationed their ship at a rocky islet called Asteris. It's in the strait between Ithaca and Sami, where Homer says there are twin harbors for the assailants to lay in wait. The only islet in the channel between modern Ithaki and Kephallonia is Deuskallio, a low sliver of stone that barely clears the waterline and offers nothing you could call even one harbor. Educated Greeks noticed the problem of Ithaca early on, and they weren't shy in their assessments of this mysterious island. Eratosthenes, the polymath who ran the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC and calculated the circumference of the earth, was skeptical of anyone trying to map Homer. He reportedly quipped that you'd trace the route of Odysseus's wanderings on the day you found the cobbler who stitched the Bag of the Winds, which I'm sure sounds better in the original Greek. But Ithaca was different from Homer's sea monsters and enchanted islands that seem to stand outside our version of space and time. It wasn't in the fantasy zone. It was a real, inhabited place in a real archipelago that Greek sailors passed through constantly, and its geography still refused to match the text. The geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the 1st century AD, took the mismatch seriously enough to try to argue it away. Leaning on earlier commentators, he proposed that the word Homer used for low-lying really meant something like close against the mainland. It was, effectively, an attempt to twist the vocabulary until Homer and the map could both be right. For the Greeks, Homer was the closest thing to scripture they had at that point, an authority cited on everything from seamanship to morals and ethics. Admitting Homer had botched his own hero's home was close to unthinkable, and the people of Ithaki weren't inclined to surrender the brand either. By Hellenistic times, the island was minting bronze coins stamped with the hero's portrait and the island's name, and there was a functioning cult of Odysseus on the island. The modern hunt began in 1868, when a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann arrived on Ithaki, several years before his famous excavations at Troy. It was some of the first digging he ever did, and if you're familiar with 19th century archaeology, you know that when I say digging, I really mean digging. He cut trenches into Ados, the steep conical hill above the island's western ferry landing, and found ancient walls and a handful of urns. He reportedly speculated that these might hold the ashes of Odysseus and Penelope themselves, despite having no real evidence to indicate it. It was classic Schliemann. The right obsession pointed at the wrong stratum. The settlement he'd clipped into, later identified with the ancient town of Alacomenae, flourished from the early Iron Age into Roman times, generations after any plausible Trojan War. Nothing definitive resembling a Mycenaean palace ever turned up there, only a few disputed traces. The British school at Athens came back in the early 1930s and did the job properly, and this is where the story turns strange. An archaeologist named Sylvia Benton excavated a partially submerged, half-collapsed cave at Polis Bay on the island's northwest coast. What she found was a shrine that had received offerings from the early Bronze Age down into Hellenistic and early Roman times. There were inscribed potsherds recording dedications to the nymphs, the same divinities Homer places in the cave where Odysseus hides his treasure upon his return to Ithaca. Among the finds were also the remains of 12 bronze tripod cauldrons of the geometric period, the 9th and 8th centuries BC. A 13th cauldron had reportedly been pulled out of the same cave by a local digger decades earlier. Anyone who knows the Odyssey feels a chill at that number. In the poem, Odysseus comes home with exactly 13 tripods, the parting gifts of Alcinous and his 12 fellow kings, and stashes them in a cave near his landing place. Either the poem inspired centuries of matching offerings, or generations of dedications shaped the poem. Benton also recovered a fragment of a terracotta mask from the Hellenistic era carrying an inscribed vow to Odysseus. This is about as direct a piece of physical evidence for a hero cult as archaeology ever produces. Unfortunately, the cave itself is essentially gone now, wrecked in the earthquake that flattened much of the Ionian Islands in 1953. So the ancient world clearly believed this was Odysseus's island, with the exception of highly educated skeptics. And yet the one thing more than a century and a half of digging has never produced on Ithaki is the thing the story actually requires: a Mycenaean palace. The most promising candidate is a site in the north called Agios Athanasios, nicknamed the School of Homer, where a team excavated from 1994 to 2011. In 2010, the excavator Thanasis Papadopoulos announced that he believed his team had uncovered the palace of Odysseus and Penelope. The Greek Ministry of Culture has been much more cautious about the find. A renewed research program has been documenting the site since 2018, and in the summer of 2025, the ministry announced significant new findings there. It confirmed a long history of occupation that includes distinct Mycenaean layers, along with evidence that the complex later became a shrine to Odysseus himself. But confirming that Mycenaean-era people lived on Ithaki isn't the same as finding the seat of a Homeric kingdom, and the palace identification remains contested. It's proof that a hero cult to Odysseus had grown up there, but without further evidence, that doesn't prove anything beyond what we already knew. Ancient Greeks, aside from scholarly types who naturally question everything, accepted this location as the home of Odysseus. The first modern scholar to say the quiet part out loud was Wilhelm Dorpfeld, and his credentials were hard to dismiss. He had been Schliemann's own architect and collaborator at Troy, the man widely credited with imposing scientific method on Schliemann's chaos. Dorpfeld concluded that Homer's directions simply couldn't describe Ithaki, and that the true Ithaca was Lefkada, the large island to the north. From 1901 to 1913, he excavated the coastal plain of Nidri on Lefkada's eastern shore, and he found real things there. This included a cemetery of early Bronze Age burial mounds that ranks among the most important prehistoric discoveries in the Ionian Islands. The trouble was chronology, since his tombs were about 1,000 years too old for the Trojan War, and the Mycenaean material his theory needed never surfaced. He published his case in 1927 in a massive book called Alt Ithaca, and he never let it go. He spent his final years living on Lefkada, passed away there in 1940, and is buried above the bay he believed Odysseus had sailed home into. He'd bet his considerable scholarly legacy on moving an island, and the evidence never quite followed him. The boldest answer to where Ithaca might be arrived from outside academia entirely, though that's not to say this was a fringe theory by any means. For example, if you're familiar with Mary Beard, the noted British classicist, she lent her weight to what I'm about to describe, so keep that in mind. In the early 2000s, Robert Bittlestone, a British management consultant with no formal training in classics or geology, was studying satellite images of Kefalonia when he fixed on Paliki. It's the island's western peninsula, and Paliki is low-lying and faces the sunset. Seen from the sea lanes, it's the farthest landmass out toward the west. Every phrase in Odysseus's self-description that fails against Ithaki fits Paliki, with one enormous exception. Paliki isn't an island. It hangs off Kefalonia by a neck of land called Thynia, roughly 4 miles long and rising well over 100 meters above the sea. Biddlestone's solution was somewhat audacious and unconventional, to say the least. This corner of Greece is among the most tectonically violent places in Europe, as the 1953 earthquake proved within living memory. He proposed that in the late Bronze Age, a marine channel had run through Thynia, that thin strip of land, making Paliki a true island. He then proposed that quake-triggered rock slides and tectonic activity had buried the channel, making the island a peninsula. Biddlestone found support in Strabo, of all people, who wrote that where Kephallonia narrows, there's an isthmus so low the sea sometimes washed across it. Biddlestone read that line as the fading memory of a real channel, still marginally in existence in Roman times. The theory even had an answer for how the name ended up on the wrong island. The centuries after the Trojan War's traditional date were an age of collapse and migration, and Biddlestone argued that as populations shifted around the archipelago, other things changed. He claimed that the name Ithaca traveled east with them, and modern Ithaki, in his reconstruction, was actually the missing Dulichian. And while this may sound far-fetched if you're not familiar with this period of absolute civilizational collapse, let me give an example of just how bad things became. During the Greek Dark Ages, the Greeks literally forgot how to read and write for a few hundred years, and when they reinvented writing, the old systems were all Greek to them. In 2005, Cambridge University Press published his book, Odysseus Unbound, written with the Cambridge linguist James Diggle and the geologist John Underhill. What followed was one of the most rigorous field campaigns ever aimed at a literary question. Boreholes drilled through Thynia, and there were marine and airborne surveys, as well as ground-penetrating radar, all trying to find evidence to prove the theory. Biddlestone passed away in 2015 with the question still open, but that didn't stop the investigation. 20 years of geoscience eventually returned a verdict, and it wasn't the one the book had promised. The surveys did confirm that Thynia is a chaos of ancient landslides, exactly the kind of catastrophic slope failure Biddlestone had imagined. The drilling even brought up marine fossils, which for a while looked like vindication. But when the cores were analyzed, the sea they recorded turned out to be hundreds of thousands of years old. A channel that had flooded Thynia deep in the Ice Age past and disappeared long before any human being sailed these waters. In the late Bronze Age, the valley was dry land, drained by rivers, and Peliki wasn't an island in Odysseus's time. Underhill, to his credit, followed the evidence rather than the theory he'd spent 2 decades attached to, and said so plainly. In most historical mysteries I've covered, something like that is the obituary, but here it led in an entirely different direction. In early July 2026, Diggle and Underhill published a paper in the classics journal Antigone. They asked a question almost nobody had thought to ask in 3 millennia. Was Homer's Ithaca an island at all? Diggle's textual case is unsettlingly simple, across both epics. Homer never once calls Ithaca a Nessos, the ordinary Greek word for island. Ithaca is instead called a land, a native country, and repeatedly a demos, a district or domain. The Bay of Phorcys is said to lie in the demos of Ithaca, phrasing that reads like a region of a larger land mass. And the men Odysseus commands, in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, are called the Cephallenians. On this reading, Ithaca was never a separate island at all, and the entire time this had been based upon a traditional assumption. Instead, it was the low west-facing district of Greater Kephallonia, which is to say Peliki, with no vanished channel required. Even Strabo's flooded isthmus gets an explanation. Reinterpreted as an overland watercourse running from an upland marsh at the height of Thynia. The 2 professors say the geoscience, the Homeric text, and Strabo now line up in a single coherent picture, one that keeps faith with Biddlestone's founding idea even as it discards his mechanism. On Ithaki, the defenders of the traditional identification still hold the coins, the tripods, and an unbroken claim reaching back to antiquity. The paper landed, as it happens, in the same month Christopher Nolan returned the Odyssey to movie screens, which I can't help believe wasn't coincidence. 3,000 years after Homer described Ithaca as a low homeland toward the dusk, The mystery on where Odysseus came home to remains open. Somewhere in the Ionian Sea, the right Ithaca is there, still waiting for someone to prove it.